I never thought silence could feel so loud until I turned 64 and spent my birthday waiting for calls that never came. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 40 years of motherhood had taught me that love was supposed to be unconditional. But sitting in my empty kitchen with a store-bought cupcake and a single candle, I realized that maybe I'd been the only one keeping that bargain. My phone sat silent on the counter like a judge's gavel, delivering its verdict on my worth. The ocean breeze through my window carried the scent of salt and possibility, whispering that some chapters end so new ones can begin. What would you do if your own family forgot you existed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my 64th birthday started like any other morning in the 5 years since Jonah died. I woke to the sound of waves against the rocky shore below our house, the same rhythm that had lulled me to sleep for the past 3 decades. The bedroom felt cavernous without his gentle snoring, without the rustle of him getting up early to make coffee and read the paper in his leather chair by the window. That chair still sat in the living room, positioned perfectly to catch the morning light streaming through the bay windows. I'd kept it exactly as he'd left it, complete with his reading glasses folded on the side table and a half-finished crossword puzzle from 5 years ago. Sometimes I'd catch myself glancing over, expecting to see him there with his silver hair, catching the sunlight, muttering about 7-letter words for melancholy. The house felt different on birthdays. Larger somehow, as if the walls expanded to accommodate all the absence. I moved through my morning routine with the precision of someone who'd learned that structure could hold you together when everything else felt like it was coming apart. Coffee first, the strong, bitter kind Jonah had taught me to love. Then, I'd sit at the kitchen table with my mug, looking out at the garden where wild roses climbed the fence posts in defiant beauty. I'd built this life carefully, brick by brick, year by year. 30 years as the head librarian at Ocean View Public Library, where I'd watched generations of children grow up among the stacks. 40 years of marriage to a man who brought me wildflowers every Friday and never once forgot to kiss me goodnight. 3 children who'd fill this house with laughter and chaos, and the particular kind of exhaustion that only comes from loving someone more than you love your own peace. Mara had been my firstborn, arriving 2 weeks early, as if she couldn't wait to start organizing the world. Even as a baby, she'd had this intense study about her, these dark eyes that seemed to catalogue everything and file it away for future reference. She was a lawyer now in Boston, the kind who wore power suits like armor and spoke in carefully measured sentences that revealed nothing and everything at once. Devon came 3 years later, all charm and mischief from the moment he drew breath. He was the child who could talk his way out of trouble as quickly as he'd talked his way into it, who saw every day as an opportunity for adventure. At 35, he was still chasing dreams with the enthusiasm of a teenager, moving from city to city, job to job, always convinced that the next opportunity would be the one that changed everything. And then there was Lily, my youngest, born when I was 35 and thought I was done having babies. She'd been the gentlest of the 3, the one who collected injured birds and cried at Disney movies until she was 15. She lived just an hour away now with her husband Mark and their twin boys, close enough that I could drive there in time for lunch, but far enough that we rarely saw each other without planning it weeks in advance. They'd all grown up in this house, learned to walk on these hardwood floors, scraped their knees on the front steps, built forts in the living room using Jonah's chair as a cornerstone. They'd brought friends home for dinner, dates to meet their parents, and eventually their own children to visit their grandmother. But somewhere along the way, the visits had become shorter, the calls less frequent, the spaces between contact growing wider like water expanding in a cracked foundation. I understood, of course. They had their own lives now, their own responsibilities, and pressures and daily dramas that demanded their attention. Mara worked 70-hour weeks at her firm. Devon was always in the middle of some new venture that required his complete focus, and Lily was drowning in the beautiful chaos of raising 3-year-old twins. They were busy, they were adults. They had every right to prioritize their own immediate families over their aging mother who lived alone by the sea. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two entirely different things. especially on birthdays when the silence felt particularly pointed. I'd learned not to mention feeling lonely when they did call. The last time I'd made that mistake, Mara had launched into a detailed explanation of her caseload, as if my loneliness were a problem that could be solved with proper time management. Devon had suggested I join a book club or take up yoga, as if decades of solitude could be cured with scheduled activities. And Lily had gotten that strained tone in her voice, the one that meant she was adding my emotional needs to her already overwhelming list of things to worrying about. So I'd stopped mentioning it. I'd learned to keep our conversations light and brief, to ask about their lives without burdening them with mine, to be the kind of mother who was always available but never demanding. It was a delicate balance, this dance of loving someone enough to hide your need for them. The kitchen table where I sat had hosted thousands of family dinners over the years. Thanksgiving feasts that required every chair in the house, birthday celebrations with homemade cakes and carefully chosen gifts, ordinary Tuesday nights when we'd gather to share the day's small victories and defeats. The table bore the scars of all that: life water rings from forgotten glasses, knife marks from hurried meal prep, a burn mark from the time teenage Devon had set down a hot pan without thinking. Now I ate most of my meals standing at the counter, reading a book propped against the toaster. It seemed wasteful to set the table for one person, to go through the motions of formal dining when there was no one to share it with. But on my birthday, I'd made an effort. I'd set out the good china, the wedding dishes that had been my mother's. Before they were mine, I'd arranged fresh flowers from the garden in the crystal vase that rarely came out of the cabinet anymore. I'd even lit candles, though they seemed to mark me with their cheerful flickering. The phone sat in its cradle on the counter, silent as a gravestone. I'd been staring at it intermittently all morning, willing it to ring, imagining the conversations I hoped to have. Mara calling during a break between meetings, her voice softer than usual as she wished me happy birthday and asked if I had plans. Devon with his infectious laugh, probably calling from some coffee shop or park, full of stories about his latest adventure. Lily with the boys chattering in the background, their small voices piping up to wish Grandma a happy day. But the phone remained stubbornly quiet, and with each passing hour, I felt something inside me shift. Not anger, exactly, though there was some of that. Not sadness, though that was there too. It was something deeper and more fundamental, a recognition that perhaps I'd been waiting for permission to live my life when I should have been simply living it. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11, its deep voice echoing through rooms that had once rang with children's laughter. I'd bought that clock at an estate sale 30 years ago, drawn to its sturdy presence and the way it seemed to anchor time itself. Jonah had helped me position it in the hallway, where its sound could reach every corner of the house, a steady heartbeat that marked our days and years together. Now it felt less like a heartbeat, and more like a countdown, each chime a reminder of time passing, of opportunities missed, of words unspoken and love unexpressed. I'd spent so many years being the center around which my family orbited, the constant they could count on, the safe harbor they could always return to. But what happened when the center grew tired of holding everything together? What happened when the harbor wanted to set sail? By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I'd moved beyond disappointment into something that felt dangerously close to acceptance. I'd cleaned the kitchen twice, reorganized my spice cabinet, and started a load of laundry that didn't really need washing. These were the activities of a woman trying to keep her hands busy while her mind spiraled through increasingly dark territories. The birthday card on my refrigerator had been there for 5 years, its edges curled and yellowed from age and kitchen. Steam, Lily's twins had made it when they were barely old enough to hold crayons, their small hands guided by their mother to create something that was supposed to be a cake but looked more like a brown mountain with rainbow sprinkles. Happy Birthday Grandma was written in Lily's careful cursive below their scribbled artwork, and for some reason, I'd never taken it down. Looking at it now, I realized it might be the last birthday card I'd ever receive from my grandchildren. Not because they didn't love me, but because 7-year-olds didn't think to make cards for distant grandmothers anymore, and their parents were too busy to prompt them. The thought hit me with unexpected force, like stepping into what you think is a shallow puddle and finding yourself knee-deep in cold water. I picked up the phone 3 times that afternoon, dialing the first few digits of Mara's office number. Before hanging up, what would I say? "Hi, honey, I was just wondering if you remembered what day it is." That would sound pathetic and manipulative, the kind of passive-aggressive guilt trip I'd sworn I'd never become. I'd watch my own mother. Turning to that woman in her later years, the one who kept detailed records of who called, when, and wielded disappointment like a weapon. I wouldn't be her. But sitting in my empty house, watching the afternoon light shift across the hardwood floors Jonah and I had refinished ourselves 20 years ago, I wondered if there was a difference between being manipulative and simply wanting to be remembered. Was it wrong to hope that the people you'd spent your life loving might think of you on the one day of the year that was supposedly yours? The silence in the house felt different as the day wore on. In the morning, it had felt expectant, full of possibility. Now it felt final, like a door closing on something I couldn't quite name. I found myself moving from room to room, touching objects that held memories, running my fingers along surfaces that had witnessed decades of family life. In the living room, I strayed on the throw pillows on the couch where my children had spent countless hours doing homework, watching television, and later bringing their own children for visits that grew shorter with each passing year. The bookshelves that lined the walls contained not just my beloved novels and reference books from my librarian days, but also the children's books I'd saved from when Mara, Devon, and Lily were small. Sometimes I'd catch myself reading them late at night, hearing their young voices in my head as I turned familiar pages. The mantelpiece above the fireplace displayed a carefully curated collection of family photographs spanning for decades. There was our wedding picture, Jonah and me, looking impossibly young and convinced we had forever ahead of us. Baby pictures of each child, school photos that tracked their growing faces year by year, graduation ceremonies, wedding photos, and finally pictures of my grandchildren, 7 of them now, ranging in age from 3 to 15. I picked up the most recent photo, taken at Christmas 2 years ago. It was the last time we'd all been together in this house, a chaotic gathering that had felt overwhelming at the time but now seemed precious in its memory. Mara had been checking her phone constantly, fielding work calls even on Christmas morning. Devon had been between jobs and staying on my couch for 3 weeks, his restless energy filling the house with an undercurrent of tension. Lily had been juggling the twins, who were in their terrible twos phase, while trying to help with dinner and keep peace between her siblings. At the time, I'd felt exhausted by the end of the visit, grateful for the quiet when they all left. Now I wondered if I'd appreciated it enough, if I'd been present enough, if I'd somehow failed to make them feel welcome enough to want to return more often. The phone finally rang at 4:30, and I nearly knocked over my coffee mug in my haste to answer it. For one brief, shining moment, I thought one of my children had remembered, had been planning to surprise me all along, had simply been waiting for the perfect moment to call. Mrs. Noxamid. The voice was young and professional, definitely not one of my children. "This is Sarah from Dr. Peterson's office, calling to remind you about your appointment next Tuesday." I thanked her and hung up, the disappointment hitting me like a physical blow. A dentist appointment reminder on my birthday. The universe seemed determined to underscore exactly how unremarkable this day had become. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden Jonah and I had planted. Together our first spring in this house. The roses were blooming now, pink and white and deep red blossoms that nodded in the ocean breeze. He'd been the one with the green thumb, the one who could coax beauty from soil and seeds, while I'd been better with the practical aspects, the weeding, the watering, the systematic care that kept things alive if not necessarily thriving. Without him, the garden had taken on a wilder quality. I still maintained it, but I lacked his intuitive understanding of what each plant needed. Some sections flourished with my dutiful but impersonal care, while others struggled or reverted to their more primitive states. It was a metaphor I didn't particularly want to examine too closely. The afternoon stretched on with the particular weight that empty hours can have when you're expecting them to be filled. I'd imagined birthday calls would break up the day, that I'd move from conversation to conversation, catching up with each of my children and grandchildren, feeling connected to the family I'd spent my life creating. Instead, I found myself aware of every tick of the grandfather clock, every creak of the house settling, every sound that wasn't a ringing phone, Around 5 o'clock, I made a decision that surprised me with its suddenness. I was going out. I was going to take myself to dinner somewhere nice, going to celebrate my birthday, even if no one else remembered it. I was 64 years old, financially comfortable, and perfectly capable of enjoying my own company. If my children were too busy to acknowledge my existence, then I would acknowledge it myself. I showered and put on the blue dress I'd worn to Lily's wedding 3 years ago, the one that brought out my eyes and made me feel elegant instead of invisible. I did my hair and put on lipstick, and the pearl earrings Jonah had given me for our 20th anniversary. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror in our bedroom and saw a woman who was still here, still alive, still worthy of celebration even if she had to provide it herself. The decision felt both liberating and heartbreaking. This wasn't how I'd imagined spending my 64th birthday, getting dressed up to eat dinner alone, but it was better than sitting in my empty house, waiting for love that apparently wasn't coming. I grabbed my purse and car keys, pausing at the front door to look back at the phone one more time. Still silent, still delivering its verdict on my place in my children's lives. I turned off the lights and stepped out into the evening air, which smelled of salt and wild roses and possibility. For the first time all day, I felt like I was moving forward instead of simply waiting for something to happen to me. The seaside cafe sat at the end of Harbour Street like a lighthouse for the lonely, its warm yellow windows glowing against the early evening sky. I'd driven past it hundreds of times over the years, but had never been inside. It was the kind of place that catered to tourists in the summer and locals in the winter, with mismatched furniture and the sort of comfortable shabbiness that came from decades of serving honest food to people who needed more than just a meal. I hesitated in the parking lot, my hand still gripping the steering wheel of my sedan. Through the windows, I could see other diners, couples sharing dessert, a family with young children, an elderly man reading a newspaper while he ate soup. Everyone seemed to belong there in a way I wasn't sure I did. When was the last time I'd eaten alone in a restaurant? When was the last time I'd eaten in a restaurant at all? But the alternative was going home to my Ceylon house and my cold dinner. And something in me rebelled against that idea. I was here. I was dressed up. I was celebrating my birthday whether anyone else cared or not. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and a young woman with tired eyes and a genuine smile greeted me from behind the counter. Just one tonight, just one. The word should have stung. But somehow they didn't. Yes, just one. One woman who had decided she was worth celebrating. One person who refused to disappear simply because others had forgotten she existed. Yes, please, I said, and was pleased to hear my voice sound steadier than I felt. She led me to a small table by the window where I could watch the harbour lights beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk. The menu was a simple laminated sheet that had seen better days, offering comfort food at reasonable prices. Clam chowder, fish and chips, meatloaf, apple pie. The kind of food Jonah and I used to cook together on Sunday afternoons when we had nowhere else to be. Can I start you with something to drink? The voice belonged to a young man, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and kind eyes that seemed to actually see me instead of looking through me. His name tag read Lucas, and there was something about his smile that made me feel less conspicuous about eating alone. Coffee, please, I said. The real kind, not decaf, he laughed, and the sound was warm and unexpected. A woman after my own heart. Life's too short for decaf, especially on ... double quotes. He paused, studying my face with surprising attention. You know what? This might be presumptuous, but you look like someone celebrating something. Am I wrong? I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Was I that transparent? Could he see the careful way I'd done my hair, the lipstick I'd applied with hands that shook slightly from hope and nervousness? It's my birthday, I said, and immediately felt foolish. Why was I telling this to a stranger? But something about his genuine curiosity made the words come easily. Well, happy birthday. He said it with such enthusiasm that I almost believed he meant it. That definitely calls for real coffee, and maybe our apple pie. It's not quite homemade, but it's close, and birthdays deserve pie. I was actually thinking about the clam chowder, I said, then surprised myself by adding, but maybe the pie for dessert. Perfect choice. The chowders are specialty my grandmother's recipe. Though don't tell the owner I said that. He winked conspiratorially. She thinks she invented it herself. As he walked away to place my order, I found myself watching him move through the restaurant. He had an easy way with the other customers, a natural warmth that seemed genuine rather than performed. He brought a crying toddler a handful of crackers without being asked, refilled an elderly woman's coffee cup before she had to signal for it, and somehow managed to make everyone feel like they were his favorite customer. When he returned with my coffee, he lingered for a moment longer than necessary. So, birthday dinner alone. Either you're incredibly independent or your family doesn't know how to appreciate what they've got. The observation was so unexpectedly accurate that I felt my composure crack slightly. A little of both, perhaps. He studied my face with those kind eyes, and I had the unsettling feeling that he could see more than I'd intended to reveal. Well, their loss is our gain. We don't get many customers who look like they've got interesting stories to tell. What makes you think I have interesting stories? The way you hold yourself, the way you ordered coffee like you really needed it. The fact that you're here alone on your birthday, but you got dressed up anyway, he shrugged. Plus, you've got librarian hands. I looked down at my hands, surprised. Librarian hands, gentle with pages, but strong from carrying heavy books. My foster mom was a librarian. I'd recognize those hands anywhere. The casual mention of foster care hung in the air between us, a small piece of his story offered without drama or request for sympathy. I found myself curious about this young man who noticed librarian hands and brought crackers to crying children. 30 years at Ocean View Public Library, I confirmed. Retired 5 years ago. No kidding, I love that place. I go there sometimes when I can't sleep. There's something about all those books, all those stories just waiting. It's like, he paused, searching for the right words. Like being in a church made of words instead of stone. I felt something unexpected happen in my chest, a loosening, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. When was the last time someone had talked to me about books with that kind of reverence? When was the last time anyone had talked to me about anything that mattered? That's exactly what it's like, I said softly. I used to tell the children that books were doorways, that you could travel anywhere, be anyone, just by turning pages. Did you have a favorite section? I mean, besides checking them all out and reshelving them, poetry, I said without hesitation. 3rd floor, southwest corner, there was a window seat there where the afternoon light was perfect for reading. I used to take my lunch breaks there when the library was quiet, he smiled. I'll have to check that out. I've been working my way through the fiction section, but I've never tried much poetry. Any recommendations for a beginner? Before I could answer, another customer signaled for his attention, and he excused himself with an apologetic smile. But as I sat alone with my coffee, waiting for my chowder, I found myself thinking about poetry recommendations. When was the last time someone had asked for my opinion on books? When was the last time anyone had been interested in my expertise, my knowledge, my thoughts on anything other than whether I was taking my medications and eating enough vegetables? The chowder, when it arrived, was everything Lucas had promised, thick and creamy with generous chunks of clams and potatoes, seasoned with just enough pepper to give it character. I ate slowly, savoring both the food and the unusual pleasure of dining somewhere that felt welcoming rather than merely functional. Lucas checked on me periodically, and each time he stopped by, our conversation picked up where it had left off. He told me about the poetry books he'd borrowed from the library, about his love of late-night reading when the cafe was closed and the world was quiet. I found myself telling him about my favorite poets, about the children who discovered their love of reading in my library, about the satisfaction of helping someone find exactly the book they needed even when they couldn't quite articulate what they were looking for. You miss it, he observed during one of these conversations. The library, I miss feeling useful, I said, then immediately wondered why I'd been so honest. There was something about his attention, his genuine interest, that made me want to tell the truth instead of the polite fiction I usually offered. Who says you're not useful now? The question caught me off guard. I'm retired, my children are grown, my husband died 5 years ago. I'm not really essential to anyone anymore, he frowned. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard anyone say, especially someone who's spent 30 years helping people find stories. It's not sad, I protested. It's just reality. People move on. That's natural, sure, but that doesn't mean you stop mattering. It just means you get to figure out new ways to matter. The apple pie, when it arrived, came with a single candle stuck in the center. I looked up at Lucas in surprise. I asked the kitchen to make it special, he said with a shy smile. Everyone deserves a birthday candle. I felt my eyes well up, and I blinked rapidly, not wanting to cry in front of this kind stranger. But the gesture was so unexpected, so purely generous, that it broke something open in my chest that had been locked. Tight all day. Thank you, I whispered. Make a wish, he said gently. I closed my eyes and made a wish that surprised me with its clarity and certainty. Then I blew out the candle, and Lucas clapped as if I'd accomplished something remarkable. What did you wish for? He asked. If I tell you, it won't come true. Fair enough. But I hope it was something good for you. You seem like someone who deserves good things. As I ate my pie and finished my coffee, I realized that this unexpected conversation with a stranger had been the best part of my birthday. Not because Lucas was particularly charming or because the cafe was particularly special, but because for the first time in months, someone had seen me as a complete person rather than just a role mother, widow, retiree. He'd been curious about my thoughts, interested in my experiences, present in our conversation in a way that felt both rare and precious. When I finally asked for the check, Lucas shook his head. Birthday dinner's on the house. Consider it a gift from one book lover to another. I can't let you do that, I protested. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it. There's a difference. I left a generous tip and gathered my purse, surprised by how reluctant I was to leave this warm, welcoming space where a stranger had made me feel seen and valued. As I reached the door, Lucas called after me. Hey, Mrs. Noxamid, but you can call me Evelyn, Evelyn. I hope you come back soon. I'd love to hear more about those poetry recommendations. Driving home through the quiet streets of our small town, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the anticipation of looking forward to something. Not a major event or special occasion, but simply the possibility of continuing a conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. It was only as I pulled into my driveway that I realized my phone might have rung. While I was out, my children might have called, might have remembered, might have been worried when I didn't answer. I hurried inside, checking the answering machine with a mixture of hope and dread. No messages, no missed calls. The red light remained stubbornly unlit, but for the first time all day, the silence didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like an opening. The days following my birthday dinner began to develop a different rhythm. One that surprised me with its gentle rebellion against the routine I'd maintained for 5 years. Instead of my usual morning coffee at the kitchen table, I found myself walking to Seaside Cafe every other day, ostensibly for a change of scenery, but really for the conversations that had become the bright spots in my weeks. Lucas worked the morning shift 3 days a week while taking night classes at the community college. On the days he wasn't there, I felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle over me. But on the days he was, I experienced something I'd almost forgotten existed, genuine curiosity about another person's life. He was studying business management. He told me during one of our talks, with dreams of eventually opening his own bookstore cafe, somewhere people could come to read and think, and of real conversations, he said, wiping down tables with the kind of care that suggested he saw dignity in all work. Maybe host poetry readings or book clubs. A place that feels like a community. That sounds wonderful, I said, and meant it. What gave you the idea? His smile turned rueful. Growing up in foster care, you spend a lot of time in places that feel temporary. I guess I want to create somewhere that feels permanent, like home, but better because everyone's welcome. I learned that he'd aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a duffel bag and a determination not to become another statistic. He'd worked his way through a series of jobs: dishwasher, star clerk, delivery driver, always reading in his spare time, always dreaming of something more substantial than just surviving. Books saved my life, he said one morning while refilling my coffee cup. Literally, there were nights in group homes when I wanted to give up, and I'd lose myself in a story instead. Made me remember there were bigger worlds out there, different possibilities. His honesty prompted my own. I found myself telling him about the children's programs I'd run at the library, about the shy kids who'd blossomed when they discovered the right book, about the satisfaction of watching someone fall in love with reading. I told him about Jonah, about our quiet marriage that had been built on shared small pleasures, Sunday crosswords, evening walks, cooking elaborate meals just for the two of us. Sounds like you had something real, Lucas observed. We did, 40 years of something real, but then it ended, and I'm not sure I know how to have something real with anyone else. What about your kids? The question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. We love each other, I said carefully. But loving someone and having something real with them aren't always the same thing. It was during these conversations that I began to understand something I'd been avoiding for years. My relationships with my children had become performance pieces. They called dutifully on holidays and visited when guilt or logistics demanded it, but we no longer had anything approaching authentic communication. I'd become the role of mother rather than a complete person, and they'd become the roles of successful children rather than the complex individuals I'd raised. The realization might have remained theoretical if I hadn't decided to clean out Jonah's study the weekend after our conversation about real relationships. I'd been avoiding that room for 5 years, keeping it exactly as he'd left it, like a shrine to our life together. But something about my talks with Lucas had stirred a restlessness in me. A need to move forward instead of simply maintaining. I started with his desk drawers, thinking I'd find the usual accumulation of pens and paper clips and forgotten receipts. Instead, I discovered something that stopped me cold, a fishing tackle box I'd never seen before. Tucked away in the bottom drawer like a secret, Jonah had never been a fisherman. He'd been afraid of boats and considered himself too impatient for the contemplative aspects of angling. But when I opened the box, instead of lures and hooks, I found dozens of small pieces of paper covered in his familiar handwriting. They were notes, observations, worries, thoughts he'd apparently needed to write down but never shared. Heir seems lonely but won't admit it. Read one from 3 years before his death. The kids call, but they don't really talk to her. They ask about her health, her house, her activities, but never about her thoughts or feelings. When did they stop being curious about who she is? Another, dated just months before he died. Mara called today, but spent the whole conversation talking about work. Didn't ask Heir a single question about herself. He pretended not to notice, but I saw her face after she hung up. We need to talk to the kids about this, but he won't let me. Says it's not their job to entertain us. And then this one, which made me sit down hard in his desk chair. Sometimes I worry about what will happen to Heir when I'm gone. Not practically, she's stronger than she thinks, but emotionally. The kids see her as a fixed point, always there, never changing. They don't see the woman who still reads poetry before bed, who still dances when she thinks no one's watching, who still has dreams she's never told anyone about. When I die, will anyone be left who sees all of her? I sat in that quiet study, holding pieces of paper that contained my husband's deepest worries about our family, and realized that Jonah had seen everything I was feeling now. He'd watched our children gradually reduce me to a function rather than a person, and he'd been worried about it years before I'd been willing to admit it to myself. But there was more. Notes about each of our children, observations that were both loving and clear-eyed. Mara is so afraid of appearing weak that she can't afford to need anyone, even her mother. She's built walls so high that love has to be scheduled and efficient. She doesn't know how to just be with people anymore. Devon takes Heir's love for granted because he's never had to work for it. He assumes it will always be there no matter what he does or doesn't do. He's still the charming child who believes his smile can fix everything. Lily wants to be a good daughter, but she's drowning in her own life. She feels guilty about not visiting more, but not guilty enough to actually change anything. She's waiting for permission to prioritize herself, but she won't ask for it directly. Reading Jonah's private thoughts about our children was like having a conversation with him from beyond the grave. He'd seen what I was seeing, felt what I was feeling, But he'd also seen it with the clarity that came from loving them without being responsible for their emotional well-being in the way I still felt responsible. The last note in the box was dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack. I need to help Heir understand that loving our children doesn't mean accepting being invisible to them. She deserves to be seen and known and valued for who she is, not just what she provides. If something happens to me, I hope she finds people who see her completely, I cried then, sitting in his chair surrounded by evidence that my husband had known exactly what I was going through and had been trying to figure out how to help me. But I also felt a strange sense of relief. My feelings weren't irrational or ungrateful. They were valid observations about real changes in my relationships with my children. The question was, what was I going to do about it? That evening, I found myself calling Lily, not because it was a scheduled call or because I needed something, but because I wanted to test whether anything had changed, whether I could find a way back to authentic connection. "Mom, hi, is everything okay?" Her voice carried that slight edge of anxiety that had become common in our conversations, as if my calling outside of our usual patterns must indicate some crisis. "Everything's fine, honey. I was just thinking about you and wanted to hear your voice." "Oh, well, that's nice. Things are crazy here as usual. The boys had me up half the night. Alex had another nightmare and refused to go back to his own bed. And Jamie decided 3 a.m. was the perfect time to ask me 30 questions about how fish breathe." I listened to her describe the exhausting details of her daily life, waiting for a pause where I might share something about my own thoughts or experiences. But the pause never came. She talked for 20 minutes about schedules and logistics and the behavioral challenges of 3-year-olds, then said she needed to go start dinner. "Mom, are you still there? I'm here. You're quiet tonight. Are you sure everything's okay?" I almost said yes. Everything was fine, the automatic response that kept our conversations smooth and brief. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I had an interesting conversation today about books. About poetry, actually, made me remember how much I used to love talking about literature." "That's nice. Mom, I'm glad you're staying social. Listen, I really do need to go. Mark will be home soon and the boys haven't eaten yet." "Of course. Give them my love." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the phone and feeling the weight of what had just happened. I'd tried to share something real, something beyond the practical updates that had become the substance of our relationship, and it had simply bounced off her distraction like rain off a window. It wasn't malicious. Lily wasn't deliberately dismissing Emmy. She was simply too overwhelmed by her immediate responsibilities to have bandwidth for her mother's inner life. But the effect was the same. I remained invisible as a complete person. The next morning, I found myself at the seaside cafe earlier than usual, needing the warmth of Lucas's genuine attention to counteract the chill of my daughter's well-meaning neglect. "You look like someone who had a rough night," he observed as he brought me coffee without being asked. "Just family," I said, then surprised myself by adding, "Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who see you least clearly." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. Foster care teaches you that early. People can love their idea of you without ever bothering to find out who you actually are. How do you deal with that? You find people who are curious about the real you. And you stop settling for relationships where you have to hide parts of yourself to keep the peace. As he walked away to help other customers, I sat with his words and felt something shift inside me. I'd been so focused on maintaining my relationships with my children that I'd forgotten to evaluate whether those relationships were actually nurturing or just familiar. For the first time in years, I began to wonder what it would look like to stop settling. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks after finding Jonah's notes, I was still processing the revelation that my husband had understood my loneliness before I'd even fully acknowledged it myself. The tackle box had taken up permanent residence on my nightstand, and I found myself reading his observations whenever I felt guilty about the growing distance I was putting between myself and my children's expectations. It was Lucas who inadvertently triggered the next shift in my thinking. We'd been talking about his plans for the bookstore cafe, and I'd mentioned that it sounded like exactly the kind of place our town needed. The biggest challenge is going to be startup costs, he admitted. Refilling my coffee cup. I've been saving every penny for 2 years, but it's still not nearly enough for a down payment on a space, much less inventory and equipment. Have you looked into small business loans? He gave me a look that was gentle, but knowing, 4-star. Kids don't usually have the kind of credit history or collateral that banks like to see. Plus, I'd need someone to co-sign. And ... double quotes, he shrugged. Let's just say my references are more character-based than financial. The conversation stayed with me as I drove home that afternoon. Here was a young man with a solid plan, a strong work ethic, and a vision that would benefit our entire community, but he was blocked by circumstances beyond his control. Meanwhile, I had money sitting in accounts I rarely thought about, earning modest interest, while I tried to figure out what to do with a life that felt increasingly purposeless. Jonah and I had been careful savers, and his teacher's pension combined with my librarian retirement had left me more comfortable than many women my age. The house was paid off, I had no significant expenses, and my children were all financially stable. I'd been planning to leave everything to them equally, as if that were the only responsible choice. But Lucas's situation made me wonder, was responsible always the same as meaningful? That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my financial advisor to discuss my assets and options. Margaret Chen had been handling my investments since Jonah's death, and she was used to my calls being about routine, maintenance rather than major planning. Evelyn. How are you? Are you calling about the quarterly statements? I mailed them last week. Actually, I'm calling about something else. I want to understand my options for ... alternative giving. Alternative giving. Instead of leaving everything to my children, what would it look like to create scholarships or grants? Something that would support young people who need opportunities. There was a pause. That's wonderful, Evelyn, but it's a significant decision. Have you discussed this with Mara, Devon, and Lily? Not yet. I'm still exploring possibilities. Margaret's voice took on the careful tone people used when they thought you might be making emotional decisions. Of course, would you like to come in next week? We could review your estate planning and discuss various options for charitable giving. After I hung up, I realized I felt more energized than I had in months. For the first time since Jonah's death, I was thinking about my money not as something to be preserved and passed down according to tradition, but as a tool for creating the kind of change I wanted to see in the world. The idea percolated over the weekend as I went through my usual routines with a new sense of possibility. What if instead of leaving my children money they didn't particularly need, I could help someone like Lucas start a business that would enrich our community for decades? What if I could create opportunities for other young people who'd aged out, of foster care, or who simply needed someone to believe in their dreams? It wasn't until I was cleaning out another section of Jonah's study that I discovered he'd been thinking along similar lines. Hidden behind his filing cabinet, I found a folder marked estate planning, draft ideas that I'd somehow missed in my earlier cleaning. Inside was several documents in his handwriting, including what appeared to be notes for a conversation with our lawyer about revising our wills. Traditional inheritance versus meaningful legacy. Read one page. Kids are all doing well financially. Mara makes more in 1 year than we made in 5. Devon will either make it on his own or not. Money won't change his fundamental approach to life. Lily and Mark are stable, responsible. Question: what would serve them better, a large inheritance or knowing their parents used their resources to make a real difference? Another page contained research about local organizations that supported foster children and transitioning young adults. He'd noted contact information for several nonprofits, along with dollar amounts that made it clear he'd been serious about this exploration. But it was the last document that took my breath away. It was a draft letter addressed to me. My dearest Evie, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're trying to figure out what to do with the life we built together. I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, about what it means to leave something meaningful behind. Our children are wonderful people, but they don't need our money to have good lives. They need to know we believe in something bigger than just accumulating wealth to pass down. I keep thinking about the kids you helped at The library, the ones who came from families that couldn't give them much, but who found whole worlds in the books you recommended. What if we could keep doing that kind of work even after we're gone? What if we could help young people who remind us of those library kids bright, hungry for opportunity, just needing someone to invest in their potential? I know this isn't what people expect from estate planning. The kids might not understand at first. But I think you will, because you've always been the one who saw people's potential, not just their current circumstances. Trust your instincts, my love. Create the legacy that feels true to who we were together. I sat on the floor of his study, surrounded by evidence that my husband had been moving toward the same unconventional thinking that was emerging in my own mind. He'd seen what I was seeing, that traditional inheritance might not be the most meaningful way to honor the life we'd built together. The next morning, I found myself at the seaside cafe with a new sense of purpose. Lucas greeted me with his usual warm smile, but I could see the stress around his eyes. When I asked how he was doing, he admitted that his landlord had raised his rent, making it even harder to save for his business dream. I'm starting to think, maybe it's not meant to happen, he said, trying to keep his voice light. Maybe I should focus on more realistic goals. What's realistic about giving up on something that would make you happy and serve your community? He looked at me with surprise. It's just ... when you grow up the way I did, you learn not to expect too much. Dreams are luxuries for people who have safety nets, or dreams are necessities for people who want to create their own safety nets. That afternoon, I called Margaret Chen and scheduled an appointment for the following week. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I began to imagine a different kind of legacy, not money left to children who didn't need it, but opportunity created for young people who did. Not a traditional inheritance that would be spent and forgotten, but an investment in human potential that could create ripple effects for generations. I thought about Jonah's letter, about his certainty that I would understand, and I did understand. I understood that love sometimes meant making choices that looked unconventional from the outside, but felt exactly right when you examined your deepest values. For the first time since my birthday, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of just away from disappointment. I was beginning to envision the legacy that honored not just the life Jonah and I had built together, but the values that had made that life meaningful. The question was no longer whether I had the right to make unconventional choices about my inheritance. The question was whether I had the courage to follow through on what I was beginning to understand was not just an option, but a calling. The meeting with Margaret Chen took place on a grey Tuesday morning that seemed to match the weight of what I was considering. Her office, with its polished mahogany furniture and walls lined with certificates, felt like the kind of place where traditional decisions were made by traditional people. I wondered if what I was about to propose would sound rational within these conservative walls. Evelyn, it's wonderful to see you taking an active interest in your estate planning, Margaret began, spreading documents across her desk. Now, you mentioned alternative giving options. Were you thinking about adding some charitable bequests alongside your primary inheritances to the children? Actually, I was thinking about making the charitable component the primary focus. Her pen stopped moving across the legal pad. I'm sorry, could you clarify what you mean by primary focus? I want to establish a foundation that provides educational scholarships and small business grants for young people aging out of foster care. I'd like this foundation to receive the majority of my estate. Margaret set down her pen entirely. Evelyn, that's a significant departure from traditional estate planning. What percentage were you considering for the foundation versus your children? I was thinking 80% to the foundation, 20% divided among my 3 children. The silence that followed felt deafening. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, concern, and what looked suspiciously like professional alarm. Evelyn, I have to ask, have you discussed this with your family? This would represent a substantial change in their expected inheritance. Not yet. I wanted to understand the legal framework first. I see. And may I ask what's prompted this change in thinking? Has something happened with your children? The question felt loaded with assumption that any deviation from traditional inheritance patterns must be the result of family conflict or declining mental capacity. I'd expected this reaction, but it still stung. Nothing's happened with my children beyond the natural evolution of adult relationships, I said carefully. My husband and I were blessed to raise 3 successful, financially stable adults. They don't need my money to have good lives. But there are young people in our community who could have dramatically different futures with the right support, Margaret nodded in the way professionals do when they're trying to appear supportive while planning their intervention strategy. That's very generous of you, Evelyn, but I'd strongly recommend discussing this with your family before making any final decisions. And perhaps we should schedule you for a consultation with our estate planning attorney to ensure you're considering all the implications. What implications? Well, for one thing, your children might contest a will that deviates so dramatically from their reasonable expectations. It could tie up your assets in litigation for years, ultimately benefiting no one. The threat was delivered gently, but it was still a threat. Behave conventionally, or risk your wishes being overturned by disappointed heirs. The system was designed to perpetuate itself, to ensure that wealth flowed predictably from generation to generation regardless of marital need. What would I need to do to make such a will contest-proof? I asked. Margaret looked genuinely surprised by my persistence. Mental competency evaluations, detailed documentation of your reasoning, possibly video testimony. And even then, there would be no guarantees. I left her office with a folder of information and a growing understanding that what I was contemplating would be viewed as a radical act by everyone around me. My financial advisor thought I was being impulsive. My family would likely think I was being vindictive. The legal system seemed designed to make unconventional choices as difficult as possible, but instead of discouraging me, these obstacles clarified my resolve. If everyone was so invested in maintaining the status quo, maybe the status quo needed to be challenged. That evening, I called Lucas and asked if he'd like to take a walk on the beach. We'd been having coffee shop conversations for weeks, but I felt the need for a more private setting for what I wanted to discuss. We met at the public access point near the lighthouse, where a wooden boardwalk led down to the rocky shore. The October air was crisp, and the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and copper that made the whole world look touched by magic. This is my favorite time of day, Lucas said, as we found a comfortable spot on a large piece of driftwood. Everything looks possible when the light's like this. Lucas, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He turned to study my face with those perceptive eyes. Of course. If someone wanted to invest in your bookstore cafe dream, not a loan, but an actual investment with no expectation of return, would you be interested? He was quiet for a long moment, watching the waves roll in and out. Can I ask who this theoretical someone might be? Let's say it's someone who believes in investing in young people with vision and work ethic, rather than simply passing money to family members who are already financially comfortable. Understanding dawned in his expression, followed quickly by concern. Evelyn, are you talking about yourself? I'm talking about creating opportunities for people who need them instead of simply following tradition for tradition's sake. What about your children? My children are successful adults who don't need my money to have good lives. You're a young man with drive and vision who could use investment to make dreams reality. Which use of my resources would create more meaningful impact? Lucas stood up and walked closer to the water's edge, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. When he turned back to me, his expression was serious. Evelyn, I can't let you do something that would damage your relationship with your family. What if my relationship with my family is already damaged? What if they see me as a function rather than a person? And this decision is about reclaiming my right to be seen as someone capable of making meaningful choices. But they love you. Yes, they do. But they love their idea of me, the endlessly available mother, the predictable widow, the woman who exists to serve their emotional and practical needs without having needs of her own. They don't love the complete person I actually am, because they've never bothered to get to know her. The words came out more bitter than I'd intended, but they felt true. Lucas walked back to the driftwood and sat down beside me. What would this investment look like, practically speaking? I'm thinking about establishing a foundation that would provide business grants and educational scholarships for young people aging out of foster care. Your bookstore cafe could be the first grant recipient. and your children would inherit ... enough to know they were loved, but not so much that they'd never have to think about anyone but themselves. Lucas was quiet for several minutes, watching seagulls wheel overhead in the growing dusk. Finally, he said, "I've never had anyone offer me anything like this. I don't even know how to process it. You don't have to decide anything tonight. I'm still working through the legal details myself, but I wanted you to know that I'm serious about this, and that it's not a whim or an emotional reaction. It's a carefully considered decision about how I want to use my resources. Why me, though? There are probably lots of young people who could use help because you see me," I said simply. "Because you're curious about who I am as a person, not just what I can provide. Because you understand what books mean, what stories can do, how important it is to create spaces where people feel seen and valued. And because my husband and I spent our lives believing in human potential, and you represent exactly the kind of potential we wanted to support." As we walked back to our cars in the gathering darkness, Lucas was thoughtfully quiet. But just before we parted ways, he stopped and turned to me. "Evelyn, thank you. Not for the offer, I mean, thank you for that too, but thank you for seeing me as someone worth investing in. That might be the most valuable gift anyone's ever given me." Driving home through the quiet streets of our small town, I felt the weight of decisions crystallizing. I was moving towards something that would fundamentally alter not just my legacy, but my relationships with my children. They would be hurt, confused, possibly angry. They might never understand or forgive me, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was acting from strength rather than reaction, from vision rather than habit. I was choosing to create the kind of impact that aligned with my deepest values, regardless of whether it aligned with other people's expectations. The question was no longer whether I had the right to make this choice. The question was whether I had the courage to follow through. When the inevitable confrontations began, the call from Mara came on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after I'd signed the final documents establishing the Noxamid Foundation for Youth Opportunity. I'd been expecting this conversation since my attorney had sent notification letters to my children, as required by law, informing them of changes to my estate planning. I just hadn't expected Mara's voice to carry quite so much cold fury. "Mother, I just received the most bizarre letter from your attorney. I'm hoping there's been some kind of mistake." I set down my coffee cup and moved to Jonah's reading chair, needing its solid comfort for what was coming. "There's no mistake, honey. I've established a foundation that will receive the majority of my estate." "The majority?" Her voice cracked. "On the word, Mother, this letter says you're leaving 80% of your assets to some charity for foster children. Please tell me you haven't actually signed anything yet." "I signed the documents last week." The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Mara spoke again, her voice had taken on the precise, controlled tone she used in courtrooms. "Mother, I'm driving up there this weekend. Don't sign anything else. Don't make any more changes. And don't discuss this with anyone until I get there. This is exactly the kind of decision that indicates diminished capacity, and I will not let you throw away our family's security because you're having some kind of emotional crisis." "Mara, no, don't say anything else. I'm bringing Devon and Lily with me, and we're going to sort this out." The line went dead, leaving me sitting in Jonah's chair with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I'd known this moment would come, but the reality of my daughter's anger, her immediate assumption that my decision must be evidence of mental decline, hit me like a physical blow. I called Lucas at the cafe, needing to hear a voice that would remind me why I'd made this choice. "Seaside Cafe, this is Lucas. It's Evelyn. My children are coming this weekend to contest my will. I thought you should know. Are you okay?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid me. "I'm scared," I admitted, "but I'm not changing my mind. Do you want me to be there for moral support? I mean, actually, yes. I think it would be good for them to meet you, to understand that this isn't about rejecting them, but about investing in something meaningful." Saturday arrived grey and rainy, as if the weather were providing a soundtrack for the confrontation ahead. My children arrived in 2 cars, Mara driving alone from Boston, Devon and Lily coming together from Portland. They gathered in my living room with the grim efficiency of a military operation, presenting a united front I hadn't seen since Jonah's funeral. Mara had clearly been designated as the spokesperson. She sat on the edge of the couch with a briefcase full of documents, her posture rigid with barely controlled anger. Devon sprawled in the chair by the window, his usual charm replaced by wounded confusion. Lily perched on the opposite end of the couch from Mara, her face streaked with tears she wasn't bothering to hide. "Mother," Mara began, "we're here because we love you and we're concerned about the decisions you've been making. This foundation idea, it's not like you. You've always been practical, responsible. Suddenly deciding to give away our inheritance to strangers suggests that something is seriously wrong." "Nothing is wrong with me," I said quietly. "I'm making a choice about how to use my resources in a way that feels meaningful. Devon's voice carried a note of betrayal that cut deep. "What's meaningful about leaving your own children? With almost nothing, what's meaningful about giving our father's life's work to people who never knew him?" "You're not getting nothing," I said. "You're each inheriting enough money to make a real difference in your lives if you need it, but not enough to make a difference in our children's lives," Mara said coldly. "Not enough for college funds or down payments or any of the things families traditionally pass down to the next generation." Lily spoke for the first time, her voice small and broken. "Mom, did we do something wrong? Is this because we don't visit enough? Because we're not the daughters and son you wanted us to be?" The pain in her voice nearly shattered my resolve. "Oh, sweetheart, this isn't punishment. This is about creating the kind of legacy your father, and I always dreamed of one, that helps young people who need opportunities." "What about helping your own grandchildren?" Devon demanded. "What about the opportunities they won't have because you decided to play fairy godmother to a bunch of strangers? Your children will have every opportunity their parents can provide, just like you did. They don't need my money to have good lives. That's not the point." Mara was on her feet now, pacing behind the couch. "The point is family loyalty, family responsibility. You don't give away family wealth to outsiders, no matter how deserving they might be." That's when I heard Lucas's truck in the driveway. I'd asked him to come at 2:00, and his timing was perfect. My children turned as one when they heard the front door open. "Mrs. Noxamid, is everything okay?" Lucas appeared in the living room doorway, taking in the tense scene with quick understanding. "Everything's fine, Lucas. These are my children, Mara, Devon, and Lily. Everyone. This is Lucas Quinn. He's going to be the first recipient of a business grant from the foundation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My children stared at Lucas with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility, while he stood there with quiet dignity, clearly understanding that he was walking into a family war zone. "So you're the one," Mara said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're the stranger who's convinced my mother to disinherit her own children." Lucas looked at me, then back at Mara. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't convince your mother of anything. She made this decision completely on her own." "Right," Devon said with bitter sarcasm. "Some young guy just happens to befriend a lonely widow, and suddenly she's changing her will to benefit him. What are the odds, Devon?" I stood up, fury rising in my chest. "That's enough. Lucas has been nothing but kind and respectful. He's become a friend because he sees me as a complete person, not just as a source of emotional labor or future inheritance. A complete person." Lily's voice was shrill now. "Mom, we see you as a complete person. We love you. You love your idea of me," I said, the words I'd been holding back for months finally breaking free. "You love the mother who's always available when you need her, who doesn't burden you with her own needs or thoughts or dreams." But when did any of you last ask me what I'm reading? What I'm thinking about? What I want for my future that doesn't involve serving your convenience? The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas stood quietly by the doorway, a witness to truths that had been festering in our family for years. "That's not fair," Mara said finally. "We care about your thoughts and feelings. When have you cared about anything other than weather? I'm taking my medications and eating enough vegetables. When have you asked me about my inner life, my hopes, my opinions on anything that matters?" "Because you never seem to want to talk about that stuff," Devon protested. "You always kept Conversations light. You never acted like you needed more from us. I shouldn't have to act like I need more. You should be curious enough about who I am to want more. Lucas cleared his throat gently. Maybe I should go. This seems like something you all need to work out as a family. No, I said firmly. Stay. I want my children to understand what this foundation represents. I turned back to Mara, Devon, and Lily, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years, 3 successful adults who had learned to take my love for granted while giving very little in return. 3 people who assumed my life revolved around their needs without ever questioning whether I might have needs of my own. Your father left me notes, I said quietly. Notes about his observations of our family, his worries about what would happen to me after he died. Do you know what he was most concerned about? That you'd stop seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a function. That you'd reduced me to the role of available mother without ever bothering to get curious about who I am beyond that role. Lily was crying openly now. Mom, that's not true. We love you. I know you love me. But love without curiosity, love without effort, love that takes for granted that's not enough anymore. Lucas asks me about books I'm reading, about my thoughts on poetry, about my dreams for the future. When's the last time any of you did that? So you're replacing us with him? Mora's voice was hollow now, the fight going out of her. I'm not replacing anyone. I'm choosing to create a legacy that reflects the values your father, and I actually live by believing in human potential, investing in young people who need opportunities, using our resources to make a meaningful difference in the world. I looked at each of them in turn, these children I'd raised with such love and hope. You're all financially stable, successful adults. You don't need my money. But Lucas and the other young people this foundation will help, they do need it. And I need to know that my life's work will continue beyond my death in a way that honors the values that made life worth living. The confrontation that followed lasted another 2 hours, with accusations and tears and threats of legal action. But by the time my children left, something fundamental had shifted. Not resolution that would take time, if it came at all, but clarity. They finally understood that this wasn't a whim or a manipulation or a sign of mental decline. This was a choice made by a woman who had decided she would rather be true to her values than popular with her family. After they left, Lucas and I sat in my kitchen, both of us emotionally drained by the intensity of what had just occurred. I'm sorry you had to witness that, I said. I'm not, he replied. I'm honored that you trusted me to be here for something so important. And I'm proud of you for standing up for what you believe in. They may never forgive me, maybe not. But you'll be able to live with yourself, and they'll have to figure out how to live with the knowledge that their mother was braver than they gave her credit for. As the evening settled around us, I felt the weight of decisions made and consequences accepted. I'd burned bridges I might never be able to rebuild, chosen principle over popularity, legacy over tradition. But for the first time in years, I felt like myself, complete, authentic, uncompromising in my vision of what love should look like, and what a life well lived should accomplish. 6 months later, I stood outside between the lines, watching Lucas unlock the door of his bookstore cafe for the first time as the official owner. The space he'd found was perfect, a converted Victorian house on Main Street with large windows, original hardwood floors, and enough rooms to create distinct areas for reading, coffee service, and community events. The foundation's grant had covered the down payment, first year's rent, and initial inventory, with enough left over for the kind of thoughtful design touches that would make the space feel like home. The morning of the grand opening was crisp and bright, with that particular quality of autumn light that made everything look touched by gold. I'd arrived early, wanting to see Lucas in this moment when his dreams became reality, but also needing the quiet before the celebration began. How does it feel? I asked as he flipped the sign from closed to open for the first time. Surreal, he said, grinning as he held the door for me. 6 months ago, this was just a fantasy. Now, he gestured around the space, and I could see why he was overwhelmed. The front room held carefully curated shelves of books organized not just by genre, but by mood and theme, of stories for rainy days, books that changed my life, poetry for people who think they don't like poetry, Comfortable armchairs and couches were arranged to encourage both solitary reading and quiet conversation. The back room housed the cafe component, with a gleaming espresso machine and display case filled with pastries from a local bakery. But it was the community room upstairs that made me proudest. Lucas had created a space specifically for programs that would serve young people homework help, college prep workshops, job interview training, and monthly dinners for kids aging out of foster care. The foundation would fund these programs indefinitely, ensuring that the cafe would be more than just a business. It would be a genuine community resource. The first poetry reading is next Thursday, Lucas said, watching me examine the event calendar posted by the stairs. I was hoping you might be our inaugural reader, me. The suggestion caught me off guard. I'm not a poet, Lucas. I'm just someone who loves poetry. Sometimes the best readers are the ones who understand how words can save lives. Before I could respond, the first customers began arriving, a mix of curious locals, supportive friends, and several young people from the foster care program who had helped Lucas paint and arrange furniture over the past month. I watched him greet each person with genuine warmth, making everyone feel welcome and valued. Margaret Chen appeared around 10 o'clock, looking somewhat stunned as she surveyed the bustling cafe. She made her way over to where I sat reading in a corner armchair, a cup of Lucas's excellent coffee growing cold beside me. Evelyn, this is not what I expected. What did you expect? Honestly, I thought you might have been taken advantage of. I was prepared to find some kind of vanity project or poorly planned venture that would justify my concerns about your decision-making. I looked around the room, taking in the sight of elderly residents chatting with college students, parents reading to their children in the designated kids' corner, and a group of teenagers working on homework together at a large communal table, and now, Margaret shook her head slowly. Now I see a thriving business that's clearly going to be a community anchor for decades. I owe you an apology, Evelyn. Your investment decision was sound on every level. Her admission felt like vindication, but not the kind I'd been seeking. I'd stopped needing external validation for my choices months ago. What mattered was the evidence before my eyes. Young people who had safe space to study and dream, elderly neighbours who had somewhere to feel connected, a business owner who understood that profit and purpose could coexist. Around noon, I was surprised to see Lily push through the front door, looking nervous but determined. She spotted me in my corner and made her way over, weaving between customers with an uncertain smile. Mom, I hope it's okay that I came. Of course it's okay. I gestured to the chair beside mine. I'm surprised, but pleased. She sat down and looked around the bustling space with wide eyes. This is incredible. When you said Lucas was opening a bookstore cafe, I pictured something much smaller and more amateur. He's been planning this for years. The foundation just provided the opportunity to make it reality. Lily was quiet for several minutes, watching Lucas work behind the counter with easy competence. I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day, about us not being curious about who you are as a person. Lily, no, let me say this. You were right. I was so caught up in my own life, my own struggles, that I stopped seeing you as anything other than my mother. I stopped asking about your thoughts, your interests, your inner life. That wasn't fair to you. I reached over and took a hand. You were overwhelmed with small children and trying to figure out your own life. That's natural, maybe, but it's not an excuse. Mark and I have been talking, and we want to do better. We want the boys to know their grandmother as a complete person, not just as someone who sends birthday cards and Christmas presents. The conversation was interrupted by Lucas approaching our table with a plate of pastries and a hopeful expression. Mrs. Noxamud, I wanted you to meet someone, he gestured to a young woman behind him, maybe 19 or 20, with bright eyes and an armful of college textbooks. This is Sarah. She's going to be our first scholarship recipient. Sarah stepped forward with a shy smile. Mrs. Noxamud, I wanted to thank you personally. I aged out of foster care last year, and I've been working 2 jobs to pay for community college. The scholarship means I can cut back to 1 job and actually focus on my studies. What are you studying? Lily asked, and I was pleased to hear genuine curiosity in her voice. Early childhood education. I want to work with kids who come from difficult backgrounds, help them believe in their potential the way some people believed. In mine, as Sarah talked about her plans and dreams, I caught Lily watching me with a new expression, not the dutiful attention of a daughter checking on her mother's well-being, but the interested observation of one adult getting to know another. It was the first time in years I'd felt truly seen by one of my children. The grand opening celebration continued into the evening, with impromptu readings, lively conversations, and a sense of community that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with library work all those years ago, around 6 o'clock. As the initial excitement was settling into a comfortable rhythm, I found myself alone with Lucas in the community room upstairs. "You did it," I said, watching him survey the space with satisfaction. "You created exactly what you envisioned." "We did it," he corrected. "This wouldn't exist without your willingness to invest in something unconventional. Have you heard from Mara or Devon?" Lucas shook his head. "Not directly, but I heard through the grapevine that Devon's been telling people his mother is funding a community resource center." He didn't sound angry when he said it. I wasn't surprised. Devon had always been the most adaptable of my children, the quickest to accept new realities once he'd processed his initial reactions. Mara would take longer, if she came around at all. But I was learning to be at peace with outcomes I couldn't control. As the evening wound down and the last customers filtered out, I helped Lucas with the closing routine that would become his daily ritual. There was something deeply satisfying about turning off lights, cleaning tables, and preparing the space for tomorrow's possibilities. "So," Lucas said as we locked up together, "any regrets?" I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I'd been a lonely widow whose children saw her as a function rather than a person. I'd been sitting in an empty house, waiting for phone calls that never came, slowly disappearing into irrelevance. Now I was part of something vital and growing. I had a purpose that extended beyond my biological family, relationships based on mutual interest and respect rather than obligation, and the satisfaction of knowing my resources were creating opportunities for young people who needed them. "No regrets," I said firmly. "Only gratitude that I finally found the courage to choose meaning over convention." We stood together on the sidewalk outside Between the Lines, and I felt a deep sense of completion, not the ending of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter that honored both the life I'd built with Jonah and the person I was becoming without him. The foundation would continue funding scholarships and business grants long after I was gone. Young people like Sarah would have opportunities they might never have found otherwise. The bookstore cafe would serve our community for decades, providing space for connection, learning, and growth. Most importantly, I'd learned that love didn't require accepting invisibility, that family relationships could evolve beyond traditional roles, and that it was never too late to choose authenticity over approval. As I drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from decisions made with courage and conviction. Tomorrow, I would return to Between the Lines for the Tuesday book club Lucas had started. Thursday, I would give the inaugural poetry reading to an audience of neighbours and strangers who were becoming friends. My phone might ring with calls from my children, or it might not. But my sense of worth was no longer dependent on their attention or approval. I'd created a life that felt meaningful and purposeful, surrounded by people who valued my thoughts, my interests, my complete self. I'd learned the difference between being loved and being seen, between being needed and being appreciated, between existing for others and living for yourself. And in choosing to invest in young people who reminded me of the best parts of human potential, I discovered that legacy wasn't about blood ties or traditional inheritance. Legacy was about the ripple effects of courage, the multiplication of opportunities, the way one person's decision to live authentically could create space for others to do the same. At 64, I was finally becoming the person I'd always had the potential to be, not despite my children's neglect, but because I'd stopped waiting for their permission to be fully myself. It was the most valuable inheritance I could have given any of us. I used to believe the most radical thing a woman of my age could do was wear red lipstick to the grocery store. Now, I know it's writing a will that reflects your true self, rather than the version of you that your children prefer. 6 months had passed since the day I told Mara, Devon, and Lily that I wasn't leaving them the majority of my estate. The shock in their eyes was a memory etched into my bones. They had looked at me not as their mother, but as a source that had suddenly stopped flowing, stopped giving. I suppose they never considered that I might want to give to someone else, or that I might want to give to myself. First, the spring after Lucas opened between the lines, our little town seemed to come alive again, or perhaps I did. I'd been walking through the same streets for years, passing the same shops, the same church with its crack bell tower, the same bakery with its uneven cinnamon rolls. But now, everything felt touched by a new kind of light. I'd never realized how much my vision had narrowed until I stepped into a wider field of meaning. Every Tuesday afternoon, I walked the 2 blocks from my house to the bookstore cafe, a canvas tote bag on my shoulder and a stack of poetry books within it. The Tuesday book club had started with just 5 of us: me, Lucas, an art teacher named Pam, a widower named Frank who only read Russian literature, and a teenage girl named Jocelyn who barely spoke for the first month. Now, there were nearly 20 regulars, and we often had to drag over extra chairs from the cafe's back room to accommodate the newcomers. People came not just for the books, but for each other. There was something special about the way Lucas had structured those meetings. Everyone was welcome. No one's opinion was dismissed. He asked questions that opened people up rather than back them into corners. I'd watch shy teenagers bloom under his gentle encouragement, retirees rediscover their passion for literature, and exhausted parents sneak in half an hour of reading between diaper changes and homework patrol. One Tuesday in early April, I brought in a warm copy of the collected poems of Mary Oliver. I'd scribbled notes in the margins from my librarian days, memories pressed between pages like wildflowers. When it was my turn to share, I read aloud from Wild Geese. My voice trembled slightly when I reached the line, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting." Jocelyn looked up then. Her notebook was filled with black ink and private sketches, but that moment, I knew she was listening with her whole heart. We all were, because that poem wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about permission to stop apologizing for not being what others expected. Permission to choose joy. After the meeting, Jocelyn stayed behind. She asked if she could borrow the book. I handed it to her without hesitation. "You keep it," I said. "I've already memorized the parts that matter." "Thank you, Mrs. Noxamud," she said. The way someone says thank you when they've been given more than just paper and ink. "Call me Evelyn," I replied. That was the thing. After all those years of being Mom, Grandma, Mrs. Noxamud, I was rediscovering Evelyn, the woman who danced barefoot to Joni Mitchell, who used to write her own poems in the backs of spiral notebooks, who once considered moving to Paris just to learn how to be lonely in French. I was learning to introduce her again, both to others and to myself. Mara, predictably, didn't speak to me for 2 months after that stormy weekend at the house. Her silence arrived not like a slam door, but like a quiet memo. "We are no longer on speaking terms." I respected it. I didn't try to call or send flowers or write the kind of email that starts with "I'm sorry if I upset you," because I wasn't sorry. I'd spent a lifetime cushioning my truths to keep others comfortable. This time, I let my words stand. Devon sent a single email about a month after the confrontation. It was terse but not cruel. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. Still don't agree with how you went about it, but I guess I understand it better now. Hope you're doing okay." He didn't reply. I didn't need to. His words were a white flag, not a reconciliation. Lily was the only one who showed signs of change. Her visit to the grand opening had been followed by weekly text messages, small updates about the twins. Jamie made me pretend to be a haunted octopus for an hour today and questions about what I was reading. Sometimes she'd even ask for poetry recommendations. I sent her my favorite lines from Rilke, Oliver, Clifton. She never offered commentary, but she kept asking. One Sunday morning, I heard a knock on my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My hair was up in a haphazard bun, and I still wore my slippers. When I opened the door, Lily stood there, holding a carton of muffins and looking like she hadn't slept in a week. "I was in the area," she said. "Thought maybe you'd want breakfast." I stepped aside and let her in. No apologies, no explanations. Just shared silence and blueberry muffins, eaten with fingers. Afterward, she walked through the house like someone trying to remember where they'd left something. In the living room, she paused in front of the mantel where the family photo sat. She picked up the Christmas photo from 2 years ago, the last time we were all together, and stared at it for a long time. You know, she said, finally, I used to think you were the glue that held us all together. And now, she looked at me with tear-brimmed eyes. Now I think we never gave you the space to fall apart. I didn't respond. Some truths didn't need affirming. By early summer, the Noxamid Foundation had funded for scholarships and 2 additional business grants. One recipient, a young man named Terrell, opened a bicycle repair shop and started teaching after-school classes for local teens. Another, a woman named Annika, used her grant to launch a community kitchen focused on culinary training for young adults aging out of foster care. She invited me to the first dinner service. I sat at a folding table eating lentil stew next to a man named Marvin who had just gotten his GED at age 52. I wouldn't have done it, he told me, if Annika hadn't told me I was still allowed to dream. That night, I wrote in my journal, legacy isn't what you leave. It's what you ignite. And yet, even as the foundation grew and the bookstore thrived, a question haunted me like a bird that refused to leave its perch. Could broken family relationships ever truly be healed? Lucas had become something of an adopted grandson, though we never used that word. It would have felt reductive. Our connection was something stranger, deeper, born not of biology, but of recognition. He often came by the house with leftover pastries or updates on the cafe. But one evening, he brought something else, a letter. I wasn't sure if I should give this to you, he said, shifting on his feet. It's from Devon. I stared at the envelope. My name was written in familiar looping script I hadn't seen in a long time. My first instinct was to set it aside, to read it later, when I was more prepared. Do you want me to stay, Lucas? Asked. Yes, I said. Please. I opened the letter. Mom, I've started and stopped this letter a dozen times. There's no good way to say what I need to say, so I'll just try. You were right. We stopped seeing you. We saw the version of you that was most convenient, available, cheerful, self-sufficient. We didn't ask what it cost you to stay that way. I was angry at first because I felt like you were rejecting us. But now I think you are finally loving yourself as much as you loved us. And maybe that's the best thing a mother can teach her children. If there's still a place for me in your life, I'd like to come visit. I'd like to meet the person you've become without us. Love. Devoni folded the letter carefully and held it in my lap. For a long time, I said nothing. Lucas poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat in silence that felt warm instead of hollow. I think he's trying, I said eventually. Lucas nodded. He is. I think they all are, in their own ways. And perhaps that was the truth, that love wasn't always tidy, that family wasn't always fair, that healing didn't arrive on time or dress the way we expected. But it could still arrive. Later that summer, I hosted a dinner at my house. The table was set with Jonah's favourite dishes, the chipped ones we never threw out because food always tasted better on them. I made pot roast and honey-glazed carrots and the lemon cake he'd once baked for my 45th birthday when I'd cried about getting old. Lucas sat at one end of the table. Lily and Mark came with the twins, who immediately began chasing each other around the garden. Devon arrived late, holding a bouquet of daisies and wearing an apology in his posture. And Mara came with nothing in her hands but a soft, unreadable look in her eyes. Thank you for inviting us, she said. It was the first thing she'd said to me in over 4 months. Thank you for coming, I replied. We didn't talk about the will. We didn't talk about the foundation or the bookstore. Instead, we passed mashed potatoes and talked about books, and whether 7-year-olds should be allowed to use glitter glue unsupervised. The conversation was awkward, at first stilted, cautious. But then Lily told a story about Jamie hiding green beans in his socks, and Devon added one about a business partner who tried to expense a pet chinchilla. And soon we were laughing the way we hadn't in years. It wasn't healing, not entirely. But it was something like forgiveness trying to take root. After the dishes were cleared and the sun had slipped below the horizon, I stood at the edge of the garden with Mara. She stared at the wild roses Jonah had planted decades ago, there, Still blooming, she said. They always do, I replied. She hesitated, then said, I read your foundation's annual report. You're doing good work. So is your father, I said. He just didn't get the chance to finish it. She turned to me then, and for the first time in a long while, her expression wasn't tight with judgment. It was open, curious, like she was seeing me not as a disappointing mother, but as a person. A woman, herself, in a different body. I'd like to volunteer, she said quietly. Help with the legal side, maybe, pro bono. I felt my throat tighten. I'd like that. As the stars began to appear, I realized the miracle wasn't in the reconciliation. It was in the recognition that we were all trying to grow again, even if we'd bloomed unevenly. And this was only the beginning. Some endings don't arrive with thunderclaps or applause. They land gently, like a handwritten letter sliding through the mail slot on a quiet morning. No fanfare, just the sound of something soft falling into place. A year had passed since I'd rewritten my will. A year since I'd sat at the kitchen table, alone with a cupcake and an extinguished candle, wondering whether silence could be loud enough to change the course of a life. And now here I was, not alone anymore, but surrounded by people, some born into my life, others chosen who saw me not just as a caretaker, a placeholder, a default, but as Evelyn, a woman still in bloom. The Noxamid Foundation had grown. Lucas and I had started hosting quarterly dinners at Between the Lines to honor new grant and scholarship recipients. Each one had a story. Some of them I knew well, like Sarah, the aspiring teacher who had recently begun working part-time at the local elementary school as a reading tutor. Others were quieter, more guarded, offering just a thank you and a smile before disappearing into the city with their plans tucked under their arms like fragile birds. What never failed to move me was the way they looked at possibility, not as something they were, but something they were finally allowed to hope for. And perhaps that's what I had become to a woman who'd stopped waiting for permission to matter, who had remembered that legacy wasn't about being remembered by your bloodline, but about changing someone's future simply because you could. One day, during a particularly blustery afternoon in late autumn, I sat in the community room of the bookstore cafe with a stack of letters. I'd asked each scholarship and grant recipient to write a reflection. Not for publicity, just for me. Lucas had suggested it. You've given them something real, he said. You should know what they've made of it. One letter came from a young man named Isaiah, who used his business grant to open a tiny shoe repair shop in the neighboring town. He wrote, I used to think people like you didn't see people like me. I don't mean just money, I mean the belief that I could do something useful. I never had that before. Now people leave their shoes with me and trust me to fix them. I know that sounds small, but it isn't. Another, from a young woman named Yasmin who had escaped an abusive foster placement and now studied psychology at the State University. Solid, your scholarship didn't just pay my tuition, it reminded me that strangers can be kind without wanting anything in return. You reminded me that kindness is still possible. Each letter was a thread in the tapestry I'd begun weaving. Late in life, and as I read them, I felt Jonah's presence beside me, not as a ghost, but as a guide. His voice echoed from the notes he'd left, from the way he'd always supported my dreams even when I'd been too scared to dream them out loud. That night, I walked the long way home. The wind carried the scent of pine and ocean salt, and I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck. The porch light was on when I arrived. I'd installed a motion sensor that flickered on as I stepped up. But I always liked to imagine it was Jonah turning on the light to welcome me home. Inside, the house felt less empty than it once had. Not because it was full of people, but because it was full of meaning. The walls bore new photographs. Lucas standing beside a bookshelf he built himself, Sarah reading to a circle of children, Lily and the twins laughing as they painted pumpkins at the fall festival. Even Mara, surprisingly, had made a reappear unscaptured mid-laugh at the foundation's summer fundraiser, wine glass in one hand, her other hand resting on my shoulder. Mara and I had not reverted to the closeness we once had, but we'd found something quieter, mutually respectful distance with moments of genuine curiosity. She still worked 70-hour weeks, still wore tailored suits with sharp corners, but now she emailed me sometimes to ask for my thoughts on poetry. She'd even started donating a small amount to the foundation each month, always anonymously, always marked for possibility. Devon called occasionally. His tone had softened. He'd even come to help Lucas paint the back patio of the bookstore cafe during the spring clean-up. I caught them laughing together, exchanging stories about travel and music, and how neither of them could assemble furniture without a full existential crisis. As for Lily, she'd become my most consistent companion. We met for lunch once a week, at the cafe or in the garden behind my house, the twins playing with toy dinosaurs in the dirt, while we discussed everything from grocery prices to grief. She had started seeing me not as a fixture, but as a person, a woman who had thoughts that stretched beyond the roles she played. Once, during a quiet moment between bites of quiche, Lily asked me, "Mom, are you happy now?" I didn't answer. Right away, I watched Jamie chase Alex through the rows of lavender I'd planted last year. I listened to the buzz of bees, the rustle of wind in the hydrangeas. And then I said, "I am, but more than that, I'm at peace with who I am." That's better than happiness. It lasts longer, she nodded, tears catching the edge of her lashes, and whispered, "Thank you for choosing yourself. It taught me that I can too." The biggest surprise came the following winter, when Lucas invited me to speak at a TEDx-style event he was helping organize at the community center. I told him I wasn't a public speaker, that I preferred to let books speak for me, but he looked at me with the same belief he always did: you don't have to be polished. You just have to be honest. So I stood in front of 100 strangers and told them my story, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with the clarity that comes from having lived your way into the truth. I told them about the silent birthday, about the store-bought cupcake, and the untouched phone. I told them about Lucas and the clam chowder, about the letter Jonah left behind, about the choice to redirect my legacy into something that could grow beyond the limits of bloodlines. I ended by saying, we all want to be remembered. But what if the most powerful thing we can do is be seen while we're still alive? What if legacy isn't what we leave behind, but what we pass forward in real time? They clapped. Some even stood. And afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My mother died last year," she said. "I think she felt invisible in the end. Thank you for reminding me to see the people I love while I still can." That spring, the roses Jonah planted bloomed wilder than ever. I spent mornings pruning them and evenings sitting beside them with a book or just my thoughts. One morning, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under the porch mat. It was from Jocelyn. "Evelyn, you gave me a book once. You said I could keep it because you'd already memorized the parts that matter. I think I finally understand what that means. I got into college. I'm studying literature. I want to be the kind of person who gives someone their first poem. Thank you for giving me mine." Jocelyn held the letter close to my chest. That year, I turned 65. There was no cupcake this time. Instead, the cafe closed early, and the entire community room was filled with laughter, music, and stories. Sarah recited a Maya Angelou poem. Lily brought a lemon cake decorated by the twins with an enthusiastic excess of frosting. Lucas made a toast that left half the room in tears. "To Evelyn," he said, raising a glass, "for seeing what most people overlook, for believing in the quiet potential of strangers, and for teaching us all that it's never too late to become the person you are meant to be." When it was my turn to speak, I simply said, "Thank you for seeing me." That was all. And it was enough. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.